There are moments in human history when the world seems to hold its breath, when everything that came before trembles on the edge of oblivion, and everything that follows depends on a single choice, a single heartbeat, a single battlefield. The mid-13th century was one of those moments. The Mongol Empire, a storm that had consumed continents, stood at the height of its power. Kingdoms that had survived for centuries vanished before their riders like smoke before the wind. Yet, in a small valley in Palestine, something extraordinary was about to happen. The hunters of empires were about to become the hunted. This is the story of Ain Jalut, the day the unstoppable was finally stopped. History, the narrator begins, is rarely shaped over long centuries. More often, it changes in a single instant, one battle, one decision that tilts the balance of power forever. The year is 1260, and in the valley of Ain Jalut, the fate of the world is about to turn. For 60 years, the Mongols have swept across Asia, the Middle East, and Europe like a tide of iron and fire. But here, in the hills of Palestine, they're about to face a force unlike any they've ever met, an army born in chains and forged into steel. It is September 3rd, 1260. The Mongol banners rise on the horizon, carried by an army whose reputation precedes it like a curse. They have crushed empires, burned cities, and slaughtered millions. From China's Great Plains to the forests of Hungary, no power has withstood their wrath. Theirs is an empire of terror, marked by towers of skulls and oceans of ash. The mere whisper of their name sends nations trembling. Yet in this valley, for the first time, an army dares to stand and say no. Leading the Mongols is Qutuz, a fierce and seasoned general loyal to the Great Khan. A Nestorian Christian by faith, Qutuz is among the finest commanders of his age. His forces have conquered Damascus, Aleppo, and the heart of the Middle East, marching with the confidence of an empire that believes itself invincible. Their dominion stretches across 13 million square miles, from Korea to Poland, the largest empire the world has ever known. But waiting for them in Ain Jalut is a very different kind of army, the Mamluks of Egypt. These warriors were not born noble or free. They were once slaves, taken as boys from distant lands, sold in markets, and trained through years of relentless discipline. They mastered every weapon, the sword, the bow, the spear, and the horse. They learned tactics, endurance, and faith. What was meant to break them instead remade them. When they were freed, they were no longer servants. They were living weapons, bound not by bloodlines, but by loyalty and brotherhood. Their leader is Sultan Qutuz, a man who rose from obscurity to command Egypt itself. Only a few years ago, he was a soldier among many. But when the Mongol threat loomed over the Islamic world, Qutuz rose to the challenge. The Mongols sent him a message of doom: surrender or suffer the fate of Baghdad. That warning carried the weight of horror. Just 2 years before, Baghdad, the jewel of the Islamic world, had been reduced to dust. The rivers ran red with blood and black with ink as libraries, knowledge, and culture were drowned in destruction. Over 1 million souls perished in a week. But Qutuz refuses to kneel. In a shocking act of defiance, he executes the Mongol envoys and mounts their heads above Cairo's gates. His answer is clear: Egypt will not surrender. The age of fear is over. To challenge the Mongols is to stare into the face of death. Their tactics are flawless, their speed unmatched. Their horses travel 50 miles a day. Their archers can strike a target at full gallop from hundreds of yards away. They use feigned retreats, ambushes, and psychological terror with terrifying precision. But more than anything, their real power lies in fear itself, the knowledge that resisting them usually means annihilation. Cities surrender before the first arrow is loosed. Armies flee before battle is joined. But not this time. The Mamluks know no fear. Their unity, forged in pain and servitude, has turned them into something the Mongols cannot comprehend: brothers willing to die for one another. Each warrior carries the scars of his past, each one a testament to endurance. They're not fighting for conquest or glory. They're fighting for freedom, for the right to exist. Among them stands Baibars, Qutuz's brilliant general, a man of sharp mind and fearless courage. It is Baibars who conceives the plan that could save the Islamic world, a trap built on deception and perfect timing. The Mamluks will lure the Mongols into the valley, draw them in with a feigned retreat, and then strike with a fury the enemy does not expect. It is a desperate gamble, but if it works, it will shatter the myth of Mongol invincibility forever. As dawn rises over Ain Jalut, two worlds face each other, one born of terror, the other of defiance. The air is heavy with silence, broken only by the distant thunder of hooves. The Mongols, undefeated for generations, prepare to crush yet another foe. The Mamluks, once slaves, prepare to make history. And in that narrow valley, where courage meets destiny, the greatest empire the world has ever known is about to face the one army that refuses to kneel. The Battle of Ain Jalut will not only decide the fate of nations, it will decide whether the Mongol storm ends or consumes the world entire. In the late summer of 1260, the Mongol army swept south through the sands of Palestine, their banners snapping in the hot desert wind as if carried by the ghosts of all they had conquered. Their horses thundered across the dry earth, bearing 20,000 warriors who had known nothing but victory. These men were veterans of endless campaigns, molded by decades of conquest that had reshaped the map of the world. To the people of Asia and the Middle East, the Mongols were not an army, they were a force of nature. For more than 50 years, their advance had seemed unstoppable. Cities had fallen before them like wheat before a scythe. Kingdoms had vanished, libraries and temples burned, and the lands they passed through were left littered with skulls stacked into grotesque pyramids, grim monuments to the empire of fear they built. Their reputation preceded them like the shadow of death. Even the mention of their name was enough to drive entire populations to flight. They moved with terrifying precision, swift, efficient, merciless. For the Mongols, war was not a gamble or an act of courage. It was a certainty, an art form perfected through blood and fire. But far to the south, in the heart of Egypt, a new power was rising to challenge them, a force born from bondage and hardened in battle. These were the Mamluks, warrior slaves who had seized control of their own destiny. Once sold and trained to fight for others, they had overthrown their masters and taken the throne for themselves. Under their rule, Egypt had become a fortress of steel and discipline. Among their ranks was one man whose name would soon echo through history, Baibars. Unlike most commanders of his time, Baibars was not blinded by fear of the Mongols. He studied them, watched them, learned their methods, memorized their habits. He saw that their brilliance lay in their consistency, but that very consistency could also be turned into a weakness. The Mongols fought with a formula: send forth a vanguard to provoke and test the enemy's strength, then strike with overwhelming force once the enemy faltered. It was a pattern that had annihilated countless armies. But Baibars believed that if he could bait them into using their own strategy, he might just have a chance to destroy them. When Baibars presented his plan to Sultan Qutuz, the young ruler listened carefully. Qutuz was not content to rule from behind palace walls. In a decision that shocked his court, he declared that he would personally lead the army into battle. His advisors were horrified. It was unheard of for a sultan to fight on the front lines. Monarchs were meant to command from a distance, far from the blood and chaos of the battlefield. But Qutuz understood something deeper. His men were about to face the most feared army in human history. To stand against the Mongols required not only strategy, but faith in their leader, in their cause, in the possibility of victory. He knew that if his soldiers saw him riding beside them, risking his life as they did, they would fight like lions. And so, against all counsel, Qutuz took up his sword, donned his armor, and rode to meet the storm. The battlefield was chosen with precision. A narrow valley known as Ain Jalut, surrounded by steep hills and rugged terrain, offered the perfect stage for an ambush. On the morning of September 3rd, 1260, the sun rose over the dry horizon as the Mongol vanguard approached, 1,000 riders, their armor glinting like bronze fire in the dawn. Waiting for them at the far end of the valley was a small force of 500 Mamluk cavalry, positioned exactly as Baibars intended. To the Mongols, it looked like another weak enemy, another foolish army about to be swept aside. They charged without hesitation, the air filled with the hiss of arrows and the pounding of hooves. The Mamluks seemed to falter, their formation breaking, their riders turning to flee. To the Mongols, it was a scene they had witnessed 100 times before, a familiar pattern of fear and collapse. Victory, as always, seemed inevitable. But the retreat was a deception. The Mamluks were not fleeing, they were luring. Every backward step was part of the plan. Their archers fired with deadly precision as they fell back, cutting down Mongol riders and horses while maintaining perfect control. Slowly, deliberately, they drew the Mongol vanguard deeper into the valley's throat. Soon after, the main Mongol force arrived under the command of General Kitbuka, one of the most experienced and feared officers in the empire. From where he stood, the valley seemed calm, the battle ahead already half won. The narrow pass ahead concealed the enemy's true numbers, but Kitbuka had no patience for caution. The Mongols had triumphed through boldness and aggression for 6 decades. Why hesitate now? With a shout, he ordered the full advance. The entire army surged forward, 20,000 riders, the might of an empire flowing into a trap disguised as an easy victory. Then the earth trembled. The distant call of horns echoed through the valley. First one, then dozens, then hundreds. The sound rolled like thunder across the cliffs. The Mongols slowed, uncertain. Dust swirled in the air. And then, from the ridges and slopes surrounding the valley, the trap sprang to life. Mamluk soldiers rose from concealment, wave after wave of them, their armor flashing in the sunlight. Arrows rained from above as thousands of cavalry poured down the slopes, encircling the Mongols on every side. The invincible army, for the first time in living memory, was surrounded. Still, Kitbuka did not flinch. He rallied his men and led a furious charge toward the southern end of the valley, the only possible escape. The Mongols fought like cornered beasts, their arrows cutting through ranks of Mamluks, their horses crashing into enemy lines with the force of a hurricane. For a moment, it seemed as though their sheer power might break through. The battlefield roared with chaos and steel, the ground soaked in blood and sand. The Mamluks wavered. The Mongols pressed harder. The air was filled with dust, screams, and the sound of iron striking iron. And then, amid the storm, Sultan Qutuz made his stand. Casting aside his helmet so his soldiers could see his face, he raised his sword high and cried out, "Oh, Islam!" His voice thundered across the battlefield. Every man heard him. Every warrior turned his eyes toward his sultan, the ruler who had chosen to fight beside them, who stood where death was certain. In that instant, the Mamluks' fear turned to fury. Their resolve hardened like steel. They counterattacked with renewed strength, their courage burning brighter than the desert sun. The Mongol momentum broke, their formation began to falter, and the tide of battle shifted. By the time the dust settled, the impossible had happened. The Mongols, who had crushed empires and burned continents, had been defeated. Kitbuka himself was captured and executed, his army shattered. The valley of Ain Jalut became the grave of Mongol invincibility. For the first time in more than half a century, the world saw that the horsemen of the apocalypse could bleed and that they could be stopped. The myth of their divine destiny was shattered. From that day on, the aura of fear that had preceded them began to fade. The Battle of Ain Jalut was not just a military victory. It was a turning point in human history. It marked the moment when the tide of Mongol conquest finally receded. It preserved Egypt, the Middle East, and perhaps even Europe from the fate that had consumed so many lands before. It was the triumph of strategy over strength, of courage over fear, of human will over the illusion of inevitability. In the quiet valley where the desert wind still whispers through the stones, the echoes of that day remain, a reminder that even the greatest empire can fall, and that no power, no matter how terrifying, lasts forever. The story of Ain Jalut unfolds like a turning point in the grand narrative of history. The Mamluks of Egypt were no ordinary soldiers. Many had begun their lives as slaves, boys taken from the distant steppes and the rugged mountains of the Caucasus, sold into Egypt, and thrust into a life of iron discipline. In the barracks of Cairo, they were forged from childhood into warriors. They mastered horsemanship, archery, swordsmanship, and the art of war with unmatched precision. Over the years, they were shaped into a professional elite bound not by blood or lineage, but by loyalty to their brothers, to their order, and to the very idea of discipline itself. By the mid-13th century, these former slaves had become Egypt's ruling warrior class. On the morning of Ain Jalut, they were ready, not just by skill, but by destiny, to face the greatest threat the world had ever seen. When the armies finally clashed, the valley exploded in violence. For the first time in living memory, it was not the Mongols who dictated the rhythm of battle. The Mamluks surged forward with a ferocity the steppe riders had never faced before. These were no frightened peasants or trembling militias. They were hardened killers, trained for this exact moment. At the heart of the Mongol lines stood Kitbuka, the veteran general left by Hulagu Khan to command the Western Front. He fought like a lion, cutting down Mamluk after Mamluk, his banner still flying amid chaos. But even his courage could not hold back the storm. Surrounded and outnumbered, Kitbuka refused to surrender. He shouted defiance until the very end, falling in battle as he had lived, unyielding, fearless. His death symbolized something greater than the fall of a general. It marked the first time the Mongol war machine had been shattered in open battle. By the time the sun dipped behind the hills, the outcome was beyond doubt. The Mongol army was annihilated. Thousands of their warriors lay dead, their bodies scattered across the valley floor. Only a few hundred survivors managed to flee eastward to carry the grim news home. But this victory was not only measured in numbers, it was a psychological earthquake. For over 60 years, the Mongols had seemed untouchable, unstoppable, like the hand of fate itself. But that day, on the dusty plains of Palestine, they bled. And once the world saw that the Mongols could bleed, everything changed. News of the Mamluk triumph spread like wildfire across the Islamic world. From Cairo to Baghdad, from Damascus to the farthest deserts, a sense of hope returned to people who had lived too long under the shadow of Mongol terror. Whispers turned into shouts. The Mongols could be defeated. The tide of conquest could be turned. The victory at Ain Jalut became more than a battle. It became a symbol of defiance and survival, a spark that reignited the faith of millions. Far to the east, in the Mongol capital, the great Khan monk received word of the catastrophe. For the first time since the rise of Genghis Khan, a Mongol army had been completely destroyed. The psychological blow was immense. Plans for expansion into North Africa and Europe were immediately abandoned. Resources once intended for conquest were redirected elsewhere. The Western world was spared, not by chance, but by the iron will of the Mamluks who had stood their ground at Ain Jalut. In the months and years that followed, the Mamluks seized their momentum. They recaptured the cities of Palestine and Syria, driving the Mongols out and restoring Muslim control over lands that had seemed forever lost. But victory came at a price. Sultan Qutuz, the commander who had led Egypt through its darkest hour, was assassinated by his own men only weeks after the triumph. His death was a grim reminder that even in victory, power was fragile. Yet his fall cleared the way for a new ruler, Baibars. Baibars was a different kind of leader, ruthless, cunning, and utterly relentless. Under his reign, the Mamluk Sultanate grew stronger than ever, cementing its control over the Middle East. He waged war not only against the Mongols, but also against the remnants of the Crusader states still clinging to the coast. Over time, the Mamluks built an empire that lasted nearly 2.5 centuries. They were not just conquerors, they were builders. Cairo blossomed into one of the richest and most dazzling cities on earth, a beacon of culture, art, and learning. Their legacy preserved knowledge that would one day fuel the European Renaissance. The ripple effects of Ain Jalut reached far beyond the battlefield. The Mongols, once feared as the scourge of the world, never forgot their defeat. In later campaigns, they faced opponents who mirrored Mamluk tactics with far more caution. The era of unstoppable Mongol domination was over. By 1300, their empire had begun to fracture into rival khanates, each at war with the other. The unity that once made them invincible had vanished. Ain Jalut had not only halted their westward expansion, it had marked the beginning of their decline. Today, the valley of Ain Jalut lies silent. Nestled among the rolling hills of the West Bank, it shows no trace of the storm that once decided the fate of continents. Few who walk its fields know that beneath their feet lies the ground where history turned. But on September 3rd, 1260, in that quiet valley, men who had been born in bondage rose up and defeated the greatest empire their world had ever known. Their victory was not inevitable. It was earned through courage, discipline, and an unshakable belief in their cause. It stands as a timeless reminder that even the most powerful empire can fall, that no conqueror is eternal, and that the courage of a few can change the destiny of millions. At Ain Jalut, the Mamluks showed the world that the Mongols could bleed, and sometimes that is all it takes to change the course of history.